cultural curator for Just Systems. Just Systems is a capacity building and sustainability firm centered in restorative practices, and most primarily the restorative practice of race, equity, diversity, and inclusion, and how we are all connected and how we can grow and learn to be that together at our optimum level. And so I feel very grateful to be here with my brother Edgar and my sister, Dr. Price, speaking on, I think, this very important subject to us. Thank you, Edgar.
Thank you, Cecilia. And Dr. Price, please introduce yourself.
Good evening, Nicole Price. I own a leadership development firm. And so our space, we think, and this highway or lane to try to get us towards a more equitable world is really making sure that the leaders in organizations have the capacity to create competence in themselves and also in others as we engage in more just systems, more equitable systems, and have greater emotional intelligence around these topics so that we can create, especially school spaces, where everyone can thrive.
Thank you for being with us tonight as well, Dr. Price. And so let's actually start at the beginning as to why this topic is important. I can share a personal story, but before I do that, Cecilia, I just actually would love for you to kind of define what internalized racial oppression looks like, or what it is, so we can have a clear understanding of what we're discussing this evening.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Edgar. Internal racialized oppression is a way in which we have all been socialized around in an oppressive society, in a society that oftentimes defines itself by race at the intersection of everything else, at the intersection of class, at the intersection of gender, sexuality, ableism, age, how educated we are, how uneducated we are, what our religious or cultural background is, all of those things, and how we have been socialized to make sure that one group, a dominant group, remains dominant, remains superior, while the rest of us who are not a part of that dominant group, so Black people, Indigenous people, Latinx, Hispanic, people of Spanish descent, and other people of color, Asian Americans, as we have seen this influx in Asian American hate in the last couple of months, and really even before that, always, how we will have been socialized to move forward in a way that is inferior. Now, does that mean that we are walking around with all of this self-hate or low self-esteem? It does not. It does also, though, mean that we have unconscious ways of being that lets us feel like that we are the other and not a part of the dominant culture. And so we'll react in that manner, not only with ourselves, but with other groups that are marginalized as well. So oftentimes friction that you hear about or have experienced perhaps between marginalized groups, Black folks and Latinx folks, Black folks and Asian folks or Asian American folks, that is a socialization process that we've been taught to have that type of conflict. And so internal racialized oppression is this thing that affects all of us. How it affects white people is with superiority, and how it affects us is with inferiority. And both of those spaces are untrue, false, and delusional. And so how do we move away from those things that are not true and move to our real authentic selves?
Thank you, Cecilia, for that. Dr. Price, I'm going to ask you, see if you have any additional definitions to add to this, but also, can you give us a concrete example of what that could look like in terms of folks who carry internalized racial oppression?
In a very basic sense, is any way in which we think that whiteness is better. How that shows up in how we talk, how that shows up in where we think are good places to live, how that shows up in what places we think are safe, how we adjust our appearances in order to be acceptable, in order to be considered normal and beautiful and desirable any way that we adjust ourselves in order to fit that social narrative. And one thing that I like to bring to the discussion is, too often when we talk about internalized racial oppression or white supremacy as an idea, people think about this and they find sometimes discomfort in the discussion. There's always a deficit narrative that tends to come up. But what I invite people to think about is, if we are truly culturally responsive, then we understand that every single culture has value and that all of our lives are enriched as we can elevate, not celebrate, but elevate those cultural norms, and we all can learn more, we can grow more, we can do more if we can not just center one particular type of person. And what I think would be relevant for this group is the way in which, as at any point we get closer to what feels normal and beautiful and right, then sometimes we can behave in the same way, the same ways as people in dominant cultures. So you asked me for a very specific example. I'll give two. Right after 9/11, we all, as United States citizens, and some of us were even undocumented, because we were not Muslim, we were found some safety in aligning ourselves with white supremacy culture. As Cecilia mentioned, right after we were exposed to COVID and those damaging narratives were put out that this was the Chinese virus, then all of a sudden you had a nation of people with some very dangerous ideas, who, even though they don't even know the difference between Chinese Americans, Japanese Americans, Korean Americans, were then directing their anger towards Asians. And what I'm grateful for is that there was a voice that was uplifted and we did get some legislation passed. But too often, when it's not us who are at the other end of the maltreatment, we will be silent. And that is a way in which internalized racial oppression does show up. So thank you for the question.
Appreciate the response, Dr. Price. And I just want to check in on our guest. And if this is resonating for you, feel free to give me a thumbs up using the reaction button. And also, if you have questions or if you have any need for further definitions or just have general comments on how this affects you or how it has impacted you, please feel free to chime in the chat. We are a small group, so we are here to have a conversation as well. So feel free to chime in. And Dr. Price says she wants to see your faces if you are able. So appreciate honoring that request. Cecilia, tell me, we're the Latinx Education Collaborative. We're an education organization. We're focused on representation that matters, right? And we want to make sure that our students see themselves reflected in the teachers that serve them. So why would an organization like us be hosting a conversation around internalized racial oppression?
I think it's very important for Latinx Education Collaborative and other organizations that support students and their families and our communities recognize that this is an important topic for us to talk about so that we can do the things that we need to do to interrupt that narrative within ourselves, so we can then advocate to the fullest for our students and their families. And that's what Latinx Education Collaborative does. It's what makes me proud to be a board member for you. It is what makes me proud to be in this fight with you. As a person who is an Afro-Latina, you were one of the first people that embraced that in me, embraced that without asking questions around, do I speak Spanish? Does my family do this? Do I do that? What have I held? And you have recognized that a part of that is our own way, and in which we've internalized this racial hatred that makes us be competitive with one another, that makes us be not supportive and encouraging of one another, because we feel like that there's not enough. There's the space that we've been made to feel like that there's only space for a few of us and not all of us. And so the more that we can interrupt that thought process, the more that we can interrupt that with our students by being their representatives, right? By them being able to see who we are, being able to talk from a language that is culturally and racially akin to one another, to be able to share from our perspectives of what the struggle and the joy of that is, and to be able to really be that for our students, then I think that there will always be a job for Nicole and I to have. And what I would love to do in my lifetime is work myself out of a job, right? Work where it is not needed, that we don't need to come in and have these conversations. And so I think it's really important for us to talk about this so that we can really advocate in the spaces where we have influence and power about the need for representation for Latinx and Hispanic students to have teachers that reflect their cultural, racial background, for Black students to have that, for Indigenous students to have that, for Asian American students to have that, for all of us to have that, and for the white folks who are in the spaces that are teaching our children as well, to be intentional about interrupting their bias and intentional about their own ready journey. So their race, equity, diversity, and inclusion journey, so that they can be advocates and allies for the students and families in which they serve. And so if we're not having these types of conversations, then what I'm sure of is that we will repeat these patterns as we've been repeating them since we've been on these shores.
I'm thinking about,
hey, baby.
I think proximity to whiteness has been mentioned, and I sometimes equate that as assimilation to a certain extent from a Latinx Hispanic perspective. I'm curious, why do we choose whiteness as the standard? Why is it that that's what's ingrained in us? And Dr. Price, I'll ask you that question.
One primary reason why I refuse to talk about diversity and inclusion and racial equity together is because the issues are different. So when you think about all other forms of difference, I can interrupt people's prejudice, get them to think about their biases, as Cecilia said. Then over time, we can shift what's socially acceptable to change how people discriminate. And then ultimately, those people who have a different lens towards what is acceptable from a discriminatory standpoint will change laws, will change policy, will change practices. Race is different in that it always, and I'm going to double down on this. Race is different in that it always starts with legislation. There's some law, some rule, some practice, some norm that says anything that is not white is not good, even race neutral policy. And then we then start to discriminate based on these laws that have caused separation. And then today, hundreds of years later, we have internalized racial bias associated with it. And so you have to separate these things. Yes, it does matter that people, the intersection of wealth and sexual orientation and gender identity and religion, and all those things matter. But the process by which they show up is just drastically different. We decided in 1681 what white would be. We named it and we said it is anything that has no African descent, no Asian descent. And then over the course of the time after we formed a nation, the US Census has changed 24 times in terms of what is white. And so when you think about how we bend and twist and adjust ourselves in order to be acceptable, it is one of the tenets of how internalized racial oppression shows up, in that my concept of self, my own self-esteem, my own confidence, if I am berated with imagery all the time, that my concept of self is going to be damaged in the process. And so when Cecilia says, we aspire to work ourselves out of a job, what we hope to do with this training is make sure that all of you know that A, this is happening, which I'm sure if you're here tonight, you already knew that. But two, all the ways in which it shows up, and then what are the strategies we can use to. We need more and more people more often understanding what the strategies are to mitigate this, because children are without power in these classrooms. And they're without power in these classrooms day in, day out, without their parents, without advocates. And if we are not aware of what is happening, then there really is no one to question or challenge what this looks like. And you start talking to people like, and Cecilia, I'll allow you to talk about your own story, but I just got off, this is fresh for me because I just got off the phone with my cousin who is biracial, Hawaiian American and Black. And she talks about how when she was 5 years old, being treated just terribly by her teacher, and not finding space to be able to be safe to just learn. And so what does it look like to be able to support those kids? What does it look like to be able to support the adults who serve them? Because they need some scaffolding and they don't have it. And we cannot wait for them to just get it by osmosis. We have to be more intentional about this work.
Cecilia, any comments?
Yeah, I want to piggyback off of things that Nicole just said, like, and to be intentional about scaffolding the work, and not only expecting students and their families to scaffold, but we as people, as adults that are in the spaces that affect our students and their families, commit to that same type of rigorous self-examination that we ask of our students oftentimes, right? That we are doing the same thing that we need to do. I can give an example of that has nothing to do with race. It just has to do with identity. When I first went into the classroom, I found myself really hard on young girls, because I was a middle school teacher initially. I've taught K through 12, but middle school is my baby. I love it. I love that age group. I was real hard on little brown and Black girls that reminded me of me. So the sassy ones, the ones that had some out of the box thinking, some kind of movement in their neck, all the ways in which I could come, especially when I was 11, 12, 13, 14, I was hard on them. And that was a part of my process of discovery of identity, to recognize, why am I being this way against people who remind me of me, as opposed to loving them and pouring into them in ways in which I love and poured into all of my students. I did that with them. I also had a different level of edge that I had with them too. And so it started my process and my identity work of, what is it about myself that I'm not quite liking, that I'm not quite loving? And then when I started, I've always done equity work and critical race theory kind of work. And then when I started equating that to, wow, this is a part of my process of this internalized way in which I will have some inferiority, have some low self-esteem, do some sabotaging of myself, or maybe not just show up authentically, maybe show up as an imposter, because that's what I think that I need to do in order to move forward. And so in order to have success, in order to have some ascension, in order to have a little bit of what white folks have. And I think that we've been socialized to do that. I put one of the definitions, there are many definitions, y'all. This is one of the ones that I like about internalized racial oppression. And then I'll put in the one around internal racialized inferiority as well. It's the ways in which we've been socialized to live out what we've been told about ourselves. So as Black people, brown people, Indigenous people, Asian American people, we've been told that we're somewhat less than what the dominant culture is. And as Nicole shared, we get that messaging from ads, from videos, from community, from our teachers, from sometimes our own family, over and over again. Then at some point, we're going to believe that. If our family tells us, don't stay out there in that sun too long, you're going to get too dark. Your color is just right now. You're going to get too dark, which I know happens in every racial minority, quote unquote, minority, racial ethnic group. colorism exists in every racial ethnic group around lightness. And so if we're taking all of that in, unless you're a robot, at some point in time, until you interrupt it, that will be something that moves forward in the way you behave, the way you act, the way you think, what you say, all of those ways. I just saw Sal said that, he said something about the Latin. Hey, Sal, I haven't seen you in a long time. It's good to see you.
Nice to see you again.
You know, I think it's interesting, Sal's point around the Latinx community being a big tent. You know, diversity, when we talk about diversity, like there's diversity within our own community, right? I hate to use the words like we are not a monolith, but that's the reality, right? We are not all the same. We transcend all different types of intersectionalities and whatnot. And so, you know, one of the struggles that I dealt with as a student, and I wrote a whole article that got published in Southeast Missouri and like back in 2004, where I was really confused as to like how to identify. You know, was I Hispanic American? Was I Latino? Was I this? Was I that? Like, what box was I at? Was I not good enough to be American? And so, like, I wrote a whole piece around that I now associate with the internalized racial oppression that I faced in my time and growing up and figuring that out. And it's interesting to me to see like the amount of work that you have to do in order to overcome that and to know that who you are is more than enough, right? Who you are, and that it's that it shouldn't, your identity shouldn't limit you to be successful in any shape or form, and something that you shouldn't have to negotiate in order to ascend into some sort of popularity or ascend into some sort of success. And so before I'm gonna open it up to our guests, because I do have a question, and I'm interested in, I don't think there's a right or wrong answer to this, but I think it's a question worth asking. Can you be quote unquote successful and not adapt white cultural standards?
Oh, it's a beautiful rhetorical question. But you know, my lived experience has been that systems will push you out if you don't adapt. But conversely, what I've also learned is all that twisting and bending and turning doesn't help anyway. Because when you get to that, if we think about success, because first you have to define success, but if we think about success as arriving at a certain level of leadership with a certain amount of influence, power, money, once you get there, most people realize that, yeah, I got a seat at the table, but I'm sitting in a broken chair. And if when I get there, I start to advocate for communities of color, because that's what we aspire to do, right? We want to get there so that we can advocate for communities of color, only to get there and be silenced. And then and that's when people meet me sometimes in a very radicalized space, because they almost cannot believe that everything you told me to do. You told me to get educated. You told me to dress a certain way. You told me to wear my hair a certain way. You told me to speak a certain way. You told me to diminish my accent. You told me all the things. Play golf. I did all the things only to get here and to still be othered. And that, for some people, is a very stark reality that is unsettling in a way that then causes I'm not going to call it a radicalization that says, okay, well, now I'm going to just leave this entire system altogether. And I think there's a better way. I think we do have to be intentional, but in that intentionality, how do you, if you decide to code switch, if you decide to cover, that you understand that you're using it as a strategy, and not you're doing it because you think that that's better, not because you think that that's normal or desirable. You have not embraced those ideas. you are doing it so that the other person or group can hear you. So I don't know if I answered. I don't know if there is an answer. I see a lot of head nods from Sal, and Sal, you have your hand up. Why don't you share with us what you're thinking?
Oh, I'm agreeing. I'm doing a whole lot of agreeing on everything. But it is, the important thing is intentional and how we think about ourselves. And as the saying goes, the truth will set us free. And oftentimes we have to step back and kind of introspectively look at who we are and what we accept about ourselves. And that can be very difficult. I can remember as a child being very angry with with the Mexicans because they killed Davy Crockett and all those darn heroes down at the Alamo. Well, I'm Mexican. I was born in Mexico, but as a child, you consume information, and it doesn't make sense till much later. I think the struggle, at least that I've gone through, is studying who I am and accepting who I am, and then realizing that I am going against systems, that I am going against people. And I'll tell you what, the most difficult things for me to control is my own anger at those systems, my own anger at the people that I deal with, because too often they're either not willing to listen, and when you tell them certain things, it just goes against all their beliefs. Because if you're going to be a country built on slavery, built on genocide of the indigenous people, built on theft of lands, built on colonialism. I mean, we had that stretch in the 1890s where we took Guam, the Philippines, Cuba, Puerto Rico, let alone the Mexican-American War. And that was all about slavery. Missouri was created out of the Missouri Compromise. Maine wanted to break away from Massachusetts. So they needed another slave state. The war with Mexico and all the lands that were ceded were based because the Mexicans did not want slavery in their territory. They were done with that. They weren't, slavery existed everywhere. So I think that I've learned that I've got to temper my anger and channel it into productive ways. Because if you've got an audience, they're listening, and they might not get the message right away, but in my experience, they're willing to listen, and change comes slowly, and that's frustrating. But if there's no dialogue with the system, if you're not talking to the system, then none of this matters. But it's frustrating. That I grant you.
Sal, I appreciate your vulnerability, and thank you for sharing that, and also reminding us that this is not new. This is not a new concept, that this is something that we've seen time and time and again throughout our history, throughout our collective history. And I'm actually, I'll ask the audience, how many of you are angry at the system? And if you can just give me a thumbs up in the reactions. How many are you? I see a couple of folks are angry. All right, got some thumbs up there. How many of you are satisfied with the system? Give me a heart if you're satisfied with the system. It's okay. I'm not seeing any hearts. I see a big no. No. Okay. So we got some vocal opponents to the system. And I appreciate that. I think part of our work as an organization is to hold space for folks and to hold space for where we are. Something that I've been struggling with, Cecilia, and you and I've had a couple of conversations, maybe not direct about this topic, but like around this subject, is we're trying to navigate the system. We like swim in the ocean of white supremacy. We're trying to do good work. We're trying to remind people that like we matter as well. We're trying to hold space for our beliefs and our thoughts and our opinions and our ideas. And we have to do this all and still like provide food for our families, or try, or like, and so part of me is like, I've been to all the DEI trainings in the world. I will continue to go to all the DEI trainings in the world. Like, when can I, where's my solution? Where's my quick fix on this? Where can I get that? Cecilia, I'm going to go ahead and put that on you.
I think that the more that we look for solution to this problem, the more that part of it is that we have to recognize that we are in constant space. We will be on this journey. For those of us who are interested in being on the journey of interrupting the ways in which we've been socialized, interrupting that which has been colonized in our mind, like these colonized minds, that I don't know that I will have an ending point or a landing point in my lifetime. What I do know is that I will have starts where I'll take 10 steps forward and there may be 5 steps back. There will be moments in time where I have to remind myself that it's as important for, as Nicole put in the chat, for me to breathe, eat, find joy, spend time with loved ones, not center the needs of anyone else other than me, that is an ongoing journey that I will be on, because we have so been taught that to do otherwise. And I think that in and of itself, Edgar, that checking off of the boxes and finding a solution is deeply rooted in white supremacy culture anyway. It's deeply rooted in, this is the way we're going to fix this. This is how we're going to do it. Moving through all of that with a sense of urgency, with a sense of perfection, with all these different ways, so I can just be done with it and it's over, is a part of that colonization that has been, that we've all been under. And so recognizing that this is a process, it's not a product, right? That we will continue to move forward in this process. We will continue to move forward individually, familially, within the collectives that we're in, within the organizations that we're in, within the coalitions that we're in, that it is a process and a journey, and that it doesn't seem to be an ending point to it. It seems to be an aha point. I'm very different in that journey than I was 20 years ago, when I had a lot of anger too. And when I recognized too, that a lot of my anger was about deep, profound hurt that someone could not see the beauty of who we all are on this call, because we were not a part of a group that supposedly has all the beauty, right? And so how do we continue to move through those things, move through all of those different feelings that will come up, all the different trauma we've experienced individually as well as collectively within our groups? And what are the ways in which we can actively know that that is a part of the process, and that it is not going to be just a checkoff box in order to move through? So when Nicole was talking about before, which I agree with, that diversity, inclusion, equity, and race are 4 different things. And some organizations, some people want to come at things just from a diversity perspective. Well, we look this way, so we're all good, right? Or want to come in from what is the quickest way to equity? Well, the quickest way to equity is doing the self-work. And then, we will show up different. We'll do all these things differently. And that is not what people tend to want to do.
It's the hardest thing to get people to evaluate and look at. We want it to be outside of ourselves. I think when I don't tend to get angry as much anymore, because while I do get disappointed, nothing surprises me. The more I've learned and educated myself, I've started to see that this has been well documented and proven, and shows up in various ways, just depending on which marginalized group we happen to be in. And I think if there's one thing that does frustrate me, is that when I'm on the analogy of a journey, while I love the analogy, but when I'm on a journey to someplace, I should see something different every once in a while, right? A journey means that I'm not seeing the same thing over and over and over again. And because we refuse to acknowledge the history of racial terror in this country, and pick your group, we keep seeing the same things on this journey. And that for me is what's most frustrating. Tell me I'm not going to get to my destination, but at least allow me to see some different sights along the way. And if I go back and I look at works, pre 1986, same story, just different book cover. And I think that's being held up by, I'll just use one little subtle thing. Critical race theory right now is under attack. And I am getting questions in RFP interviews to say, well, do you teach critical race theory? And I know the purpose of the question. The purpose of the question is, if you teach critical race theory, you're probably not the person for us. And so my question back is, critical race theory, what components of it are you most concerned about? Because I know when I ask that question, no one in the room asking me has actually read anything about critical race theory, even though Delgado's book is free on the internet for anyone who's interested in learning about it. And if I will not acknowledge a thing, if I don't even want to name a thing, if I don't even want to read about it, that's the first step towards any kind of change effort, social or otherwise. Yeah, I had to pull mine out on some folks today. It's in bad shape over here. But this is a strategy, and I know we're going to get to this in our actual workshop. But one thing that I also do, so I ask people first, like, okay, which tenets of it do you want to know? Do I teach? Because then that gives me some indication of if people in the room have actually read about what they're asking about. But another thing I do is, tell me what's your definition of racism? And in the spaces where I move, people will talk about systems. They will talk about, you don't have to have intentionality. They will talk about, people not being in dominant groups and people being in underrepresented groups. And it's at that moment that I'll say, well, you've now just shared with me 2/3 of the theory of critical race theory. We'll get to the last 1/3. And just to kind of help people to see, this is just, as Cecilia points out, just a different narrative from a different lens. This is the hunted telling their version of the story rather than the hunter. And that makes it no less true. And we got to get to a point where educators are not the people who are pushing against being educated about this topic. I just don't understand how you can call yourself an educator and there's certain things that you're just like, I don't need to be educated on that. We should all be part of learning cultures.
I appreciate that perspective, Dr.
And that
Price.
I don't want to. And that I get to choose.
Yeah. And I don't have to, because the government will back me even.
Dr. Price, I'd love to offer one more perspective on, I love your idea of the journey, and I love this idea and concept of like, you expect to see different things. And I'm going to offer up to, sometimes like what truly changes is yourself, right? And so on that journey, maybe it's not about the changing the scenery, but it's how you react and you approach it and how you navigate it in a different way. So I'm thinking about that and connecting it to my own journey. And like, you're absolutely right. Like, this is not different, a conversation. And this is a conversation that's going to continue to be had, because the reality is we have new generations of folks coming into this conversation who don't understand or don't want to understand or don't appreciate or whatnot. But I think a lot of this work is internal work and it's self-work. And so hopefully the view may not change, but like how you perceive it and how you deal with it and how you navigate through it is what changes at that. So just a different offering in that. And we have a couple of questions. Actually, a comment from Noemi who says, decolonization is not a metaphor. It is a painful, not painless, definitely painful process and lifelong journey. And then we have Courtney. How do we navigate these complexes when in proximity to other demographics who live in the margins as well and use biases against each other? I'm hearing solidarity issues there. I'm hearing, deficit mindsets in there as well. And so those are questions that we often have to overcome, crabs in a barrel type of another analogy that I've heard discussed there. And how do we get others of the same demographic to buy into understanding of these concepts that have been embedded so deeply? And if I can just editorialize that a little bit, like I agree. I'm not surprised by people's actions or what people say, and that no longer surprises me. But when I hear it from my members of my own community, it's frustrating. It's disappointing, but mostly I'm just hurt. Like I leave with the hurt feeling of like, I have to battle this in other places, like, and then I also have to battle it within my own community, the community that I want to feel safe, and absolutely members of our own family too. No easy answers today, but I will invite the fact that this is going to be a continuing conversation with the LEC, and I'm going to shift because I want to know a little bit more about how we're going to support folks through this journey. And so Cecilia, talk a little bit more about like what the workshops look like, what we're going to do, and how we're going to continue this conversation to make sure that a year from now, we may be seeing the similar things, but we're in different places internally.
So one of the things that Dr. Price and I definitely want to address is, what internal racialized inferiority is, being able to identify where we are in that journey, in that movement, in that progression, hopefully out of or interrupting. And then look at the ways in which, if we're not careful, that will manifest itself in all types of ways. It'll manifest itself in how we deal with folks from dominant culture. It'll manifest itself in how we deal with people within our own margins, and how we will manifest it with people who are a part of other marginalized groups that are within our margins too, that are as marginalized as we are. And so we want to look at that and want to come up with ways in which we can make a different choice, come up with ways in which we can help one another to recognize that, not to quote a cliche, but it really is true in this space, that none of us are free until we're all free. So how do we do the things in which we can really move in support, encouragement, and move towards that coalition and solidarity that you were talking about, Edgar, and making sure that we're doing so by centering what prophets had said are the least of these, that if we are doing our best to center our students who are the sand at the bottom of the ocean, that as that sand rises, so does everything in between, up to the waves, and even the boats will rise. And so one of the things I think happens with people who are acting out of this basically rage around critical race theory is there's this deficit mindset and feeling of, well, if they have their say, if they have their ways of thinking about this, then it's going to take away something that I have, as opposed to not realizing that everything rises when that sand at the bottom of the ocean rises. So if you're at the boat up at the top, your boat's going to rise too. If you're somewhere in between, you're going to rise too. If that sand rises, then we all rise. And so really moving from those perspectives of how we can then move in community with one another, how we can do things to intentionally interrupt that way in which internal racialized inferiority plays out within us. And to make sure that those are not things that we choose to, by either making a choice or by being unconscious in our choices, move forward with our students and their families. And I think oftentimes it's easy for us to do that with some groups. It's not always easy for us to do that with all groups. And so we want to really talk about why that is important and why we must do that. Nicole, would you like to add some too, please?
Yeah, our hope is truly to just in class talk about what the situation is. Cecilia's going to give us the background. We will share an assessment of what that means for us today, and then make recommendations for you all in your own journeys. And hopefully you'll leave with, kind of your own personal development plan about what you think you can do in this space to make sure that neither internalized racial inferiority or internalized racial oppression are things that we are helping to perpetuate. And every day we are going to vacillate between doing an excellent job at that, and other days we might have to say, dang, I didn't quite get it right today. But ultimately, if we can stay in conversations, like stop cutting people off who are on this journey with us, but they just might be behind us. We have to try to figure out ways to help bring more people along more often, because it's at the intersection of many of these things. The more marginalized groups you tend to be in, you can find yourself in a room where, gosh, these seem like people who would get it. And then again, and so we realize that it's complex, and our hope is to help you find, how you're going to help us kind of try to tackle this in the time that we still have here left on the planet. Did I get it, Cecilia? Okay.
I also say ultimately one of our goals is to help people find peace. I think that this is one of those things that we often are thinking about, or we think about, or we're in spaces and it's either an elephant in the room or it's explicit. And for us, our goal with providing these type of resources and these type of conversations and holding space is that you model a different way for future generations, right? When you're in a classroom, when you're in a school building, wherever you're serving, that you're able to model a different way and demonstrate that there are ways of living where we don't give of ourselves, and where we hold boundaries, where we just are. And so, Sal, I see that you have a question. Will you provide self-assessment tools, guides, etc.? Cecilia, I will kick that to you.
Yeah, I think that there are ways in which we can do that, Sal, where we can definitely help people to identify where they are on their journey, and to share through personal narrative our journeys as well, and to be able to identify that. I don't want to tell Nicole's story, but one of the things I love is her transparency, and she talked about before she got this, right? Nicole, will you share that story about how you used to think that perhaps people weren't trying quite as hard as they should, or doing all that they could do to...
I tell so many stories. So I was like, is this the exceptionalism story? Yeah. So, grew up in poverty, grew up with, my dad died. And so therefore single parent of 7 kids in the heart of the city. And just with many of the struggles that are consistent with some Black people. But I was smart, and I learned in the system, the way it was designed. The system, the way teachers teach in the current system works for me. And so because of that, as I matriculated through high school and college, and then the corporate America, and I'm getting promoted, I started to think, well, gosh, if other people would just work harder, if they would try, if they wouldn't be engaged in detrimental behaviors, I can't remember what the Surgeon General's name was when he suggested that if we just didn't eat what Grandma and Pawpaw suggested, that somehow we would be in better health. That concept of exceptionalism, when you have not been taught any better, you don't realize that the system is designed to let some of us get through. And then again, it is not until you get to that seat at the table and then realize, oh crap, this chair is broken. And then you start to really unpack what you have not learned, that you see, oh my gosh, here I was perpetuating some of these same myths. Did I too believe in the model minority? Did I too believe that people should assimilate if they wanted to live here? Yes. And those things are still pervasive today. And I think as more and more of us are truly honest about how ignorant we were at the start of our journeys, I think it would allow people to open up to talk about what they don't know, so that we can help to close those gaps and create some scaffolding. I don't know if any of you have ever worked with adults who cannot read, but adult people who are illiterate are very skilled at hiding that illiteracy from you. And so therefore you cannot help them learn to read because you don't realize that there is a problem. And that is what we run into oftentimes as we talk about these challenges with internalized racial oppression and internalized racial inferiority. We are helping to uphold white supremacy when we won't acknowledge that we have these gaps in our understanding. And I am no different. That was me too. I grew up in K through 12 education in Kansas City, Missouri, with a parent who thought, somehow if, you just go to school and get educated, that you can also, absolve yourself of these problems. And because of that, I think that gives me the open-heartedness to give a lot of grace to people as they are learning and growing on the journey. I also give a lot of grace to myself to know that there's something that I might not have known, and now I know it today. Like I just learned today that there's some occupation that white people are trying to do right now in Hawaii. We don't have to go back 10 years, right now. And I'm like, where have I been? How did I miss that? How did I not know about that? And so I share that story because I think if I'm open and vulnerable, that will allow other people to be open and vulnerable to what they don't know, so we can close those gaps.
We talk about exceptionalism. I have my own stories surrounded with exceptionalism, and I'll be sharing that with you throughout this journey as well. But it reminded me of something that I read earlier today. So here in Missouri, we have HB, HB 952, and there was public testing, which is to ban the teaching of 1619 Project and critical race theory in general. And
it's tricky, right, Edgar? Because it started out as HB 1141, and then they'll put it onto something else and add it onto something else. So those of us who are even trying to be aware and that even know to be, I don't even want to say, because, we have created a system where people just don't know how to move into if it is not a part of what they do around policy. And it has shifted 5 times in the 3 months that folks were in session so that people couldn't find it. Sorry, Edgar, I didn't mean to interrupt.
That's all good. I was struck by that one comment, and I think we can close from there. But the comment that I struck with was there's public testimony against the bill, or for the bill, excuse me. And I'm going to quote, "I am against teaching students the 1619 Project because it teaches students to reject the truth of American exceptionalism. It seeks to create the myth that our country and all of its accomplishments, both as a whole and individually, are founded upon and the direct result of racism." And in that comment, it strikes me because there's a lot there, but I think it's an ironic comment on so many levels, and this is why we do this work, and this is why it's important to continue to have these conversations. And so I encourage you all to join us. We will be sending out a follow-up email with new dates for the workshops, and we're going to put a plan together as to how we're going to continue engaging this work long term. But I sincerely thank everyone for joining us this evening. I thank Dr. Price and Cecilia for leading us through this journey. And any final thoughts?
I'd be interested in knowing who thinks that they would actually come to the workshop on the line. And if so, why? If not, why not? Like, what else were you hoping to get? So we can maybe adjust the content.
I would love to come. This is Sal. This is fantastic. I think any time that you have an opportunity to be both introspective and look at the bigger picture from an individual to a systems view, I mean, this is great. And we can talk about race, ethnicity, culture, language, all of those things that make us such a unique community. And we all have great stories. You told a great story. Maybe it's an opportunity for us to share those stories as part of the curriculum. I don't know, but it sounds very, very positive to me.
Thank you, Sal. Storytelling is a beautiful way to help people kind of get their heads wrapped around this and running things through their own racial lens and their own racial history. So we certainly do intend to use storytelling. Okay, looks like we got a lot of yeses with interest, and I think it'll be nice for a change to talk about it from this lens of internalized racial inferiority. So looking forward to seeing you all in June, and thank you so much for being on with us tonight.
And just so you all know quickly, there'll be no cost to folks who attend, and so that is our commitment to our community, that this information is free and that you're able to engage as you need to. So thank you all. Have a great remainder of your evening. I look forward. You'll receive a follow-up email from me by tomorrow, and we will go from there.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you all.